Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that we are starting up. It's only really in its first kind of round of being established. And this is to start building a proper archive for the Robinson College Boat Club and also for the Pegasus Society. So 1981 to 2021. This is 40 years of Robinson College Boat Club. It's one of our first, it's our fourth major anniversary in a sense. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we have already. So some of the history, how we're going to break down the history and kind of what the archive project's going to be about moving forwards. So 1981 was an influential year and in many ways the start of a new era. It was the first year that the London Marathon was run. So on the 29th of March, the first running of the marathon. And then in April, we had the first space shuttle mission, which now you will know is not Apollo, but this is Columbia. And then in September, we had the setup of a real British icon. And it was the first time Postman Pat appeared on our screens. But I'd say that the most important thing about 1981 was the setup of a new boat club, and that was Robinson College Boat Club. So the early years of Robinson, we can talk about as being the 1980s, really. Now, obviously, I wasn't there, but we have quite a few reports and pictures that have already been sent in that allow us to build up a bit of a picture of what the boat club was like at the time. So here is the first men's boat racing in their inaugural May boat campaign in 1981. I don't actually know how well they did. It looks like they got blades on the bottom. And here we have them on the right in their blazers. So from our reports, we see that these early days of the club were really quite a long way away from what we do now in the boat club, in the sense that the resourcefulness that they needed to even get a boat on the water is quite remarkable. So early in these years, they had the college electrician was the one pushing the boat off the river for the bumps. They had circuit training in the car park downstairs, sponsored by a brewery from Suffolk, and the coach for the first boat was apparently a chef from Newnham. So it really was kind of pulling together people who could help in as many ways that they could possibly get, as we didn't have things like coaches. But the early years were obviously very successful. So the first boat started in the bottom of the second division and slowly climbed as it ate up all of the lower boats in those divisions. But as we moved into the 1990s, things start to get a little bit more exciting for the crews. So the success really starts in 1991 here. And so W1 win the Fairbairn Cup, which I believe is the only time that a Robinson senior boat has won an 8th division in Fairbairns. So the men won the 4s in 2003 and 2004. But yeah, this is the first time and the only time we've come close. And the success continued in the bumps. So 92 saw the W1 enter the 1st division for the first time. And indeed, they returned to the division later in 1999. The first boat weren't to be left out here. So I believe they first bumped up into M1 in about 91, and they got blades from 95 to 97. So this is a period where the club is really starting to grow, starting to pull on a lot of resources that we have, and really starting to move up the bumps charts. In 1992, there is an exceptional, and I'd love to learn more about this campaign. W2 have an up 8. So they double over bump on day 1 and they blade for the rest of the week. But the real success, I think, of this decade probably has to go to M2. And they had remarkable blades in 92, 93, 94, 96, 97, 98, and 99. And in that, they moved up a total of 37 places. So the 90s really involved a lot of success in the river. And this was not reflected only in the Robinson boats, but also as we had members move into the blue boats. And these are some of the members who raced in the blue boats in that period. And of course, who could forget in 1996, the arrival of a one William Nolan to the boat club and how much of an influence he would have in the later years of the club. Now, the 2000s marks, I think, a slightly different period in the club and one of a real rise and fall. And so in the early periods, you had the 2000s and the first few years where the club gets quite high up the first division. And this happens on both sides of the club. So W1 enter up to 13th in the Maze first division, which I believe is their highest position. And the first boat were up as high as position 4. And this is a period where we start to really see the old blades kicking in as a society. So a lot of the old rowers coming back to coach the crews, and that kind of building of a club that has a support network from its alumni. And obviously this was completely absent in our first few years. But by the end of the 2000s, we'd fallen back to the second division in both cases. So M1 finished the decade in first place, and W1 were back into 8th in the second division. So this is a real period where you climb up the divisions and seem to come back down. And it'd be really interesting to understand how the club reacted to that sudden change in in fortunes, and how they tried to arrest the slide in a way. But I think you then move into this kind of fourth decade that we experienced, where we start to do that process of slowing the slide and even turning around our fortunes to climb back up again. And in many ways, this is the setting up of a longer term club, a modern club, which is designed to last for hopefully the future. Obviously, I'm much more familiar with this period, but to me, it kind of is characterized by changes in the constitution to introduce a presidency and somebody who would oversee the whole club. The re-establishment of the Pegasus Boat Club to create a new kind of support network and try and reinvigorate that alumni support. And obviously that translating into new boats for the club, a new infrastructure on the water, and the connections that we build through our new boats. So this is a bit of an idea of how the history of the club has moved through the 4 different decades and into the future. But I think the really important thing we can see is that the club has a lot of traditions, and the club's members are all members who have done the same thing in different periods. You've raced, tried to win bumps races, had dinners, and all these different things. So we see here that, the club has these traditions of blazers that were established basically in the first years of the club. And these are all carried through to where we are. Of course, there are some slight differences. I think the haircuts have slightly changed. You don't have quite so many people in white trousers. That seems to be swapped for black trousers. But many of those changes, you'd probably agree, are good changes. Of course, there's other things that we all share through our experiences, the weather. So here's a picture from 1983, I think, or when the river was completely frozen. And indeed, they took to rowing on the ice rather than actually getting any water training. But of course, this isn't much different from 2017, 18, when we were out scraping the towpath just to make sure bumps is going ahead. So, dealing with the weather, dealing with the cold, it's all part of the same rowing experience that we've all taken part in. And of course, there's also the success and the feeling of how bumps, success in the bumps goes, and all the traditions of foliage and blades and the various different times that we've been moving up as a club. So in a way, compared to many of the other clubs on the river, we're in a very lucky position, because we're in a position where our history is completely accessible to us. People like Lady Margaret, they can't talk to the people who set up the club anymore. They can't talk to the people who were the first people to race bumps and things like that, but we can. So what we want to do is start to make this record before it's too late and before the information starts to get forgotten or lost. So there's 3 kind of stages to the process. The first is to collect material and to make a record of what the club has done. And many of these are personal memories. So it may be your experience of what the club was like in your time, what the boat races were like, what the dinners were like, what the bumps were like. But we're also interested in things like, what was the infamous race from your period? So, for example, in my period, we might talk about the story of how Steve held off Lady Margaret M2 by rowing short as he came under the railway bridge. And it would be interesting to hear what those infamous races from different periods that made a mark on how people raced in the future. But I'm really interested in trying to understand what life was like throughout the club. So from what I've talked about, you have quite a good idea of how the first boats perform. It's quite easy to put together a picture of results, and it's quite easy to get pictures of blading crews and things like that. But it would be nice to really get an idea of what the lower boats were like, what the, an even side, so how the men were doing, how the women were doing, how they were interacting with each other at the time, and all this sort of picture of what the club really felt like to be during the earlier years of the club. So once we've collected these sort of memories, it comes on to this level of understanding. And I think it would be important for us to try and understand how the key events that we had during the past may define the club's future. So when we were doing very well in the early 80s and the 90s, how has that laid the foundations for what we now do now in the club? But also, again, this feeling of the atmosphere in the club. So were we a competitive club? Did we feel like we were a competitive club? Were people just doing it because it's a good activity? Or did it feel like a professional rowing club? And I'm sure that these feelings have evolved and changed as the club has gone up and down in the bumps charts. But I think this is really going to allow us to piece together a really fascinating history of the club itself. And finally, I think, again, in this sort of area, it would be really interesting to try and understand how these challenges have been overcome. So perhaps we lost all of our first boat in one go. And how did we rebuild? How did we make sure that that was never going to happen again? And this will come through understanding what the club was doing at these different years. Having established these, what we're trying to do with this archive is to create, firstly, an archive of the material, so an archive of pictures and stories that people might be able to look through. And I think we'll try and make this available as an online blog as it becomes available. So we'll talk to you each time about perhaps a different period or a different kind of theme of the club as we start to piece together the history. And our kind of big ambition on this is to put together perhaps a commemorative book that lays down the first 50 years for our 50th anniversary in 2031. So that's obviously quite a long way away. But if we start the work now, then we can really collect this information and make something really comprehensive. So how can you help? Well, the first things first is to help us out by providing an account of your time in the club. Pictures are brilliant, but words are better in many ways. So if you can answer many of the questions that are kind of mentioned on the previous slide, then that would be really, really useful for us. The second thing we kind of have identified as an important thing is to create this chain of knowledge. So we'll probably be sending out some emails to people who get in contact with us to find out more from them and try and have a conversation about what their time in the club was like. And from there, perhaps being able to pass us on to other people who were in your year groups or in the years above or who you knew about. And we can start to piece together the gaps in the history where we don't know so much about. And of course, part of that is encouraging your peers to get in touch with us. So if you know people who were, like I say, a couple of years above you, who would be able to tell us about a period we don't know about, then that would be really, really useful for us. And of course, there's more than enough to be getting done. So if you want to get involved with the process, please get in touch, and it would be a massive help to help collate the material. So obviously, in the same way as 1981, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So we don't want to, we want to make sure we're creating something that's sustainable and hopefully creates a really interesting archive to help us move forward as a club and create the next kind of stage of history. And I'd happily take any questions.
So the first question, I guess, Hugh, has to be, Nick pointed out in the chat that you've missed some quite important things from the 80s, which is we had 2 Olympians and a number of blues. Shipley suggested that maybe you don't have material, but you also had plenty of other things to cover in the 80s. So explain yourself, young man.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We are aware of these things. It's quite hard to piece together the history of these periods because there's no massive online records. It was not supposed to be comprehensive. It's more the way that the way that I was talking. So yeah, I'd love more information about these areas. And yes, obviously we can't forget John Pritchard.
Or Rachel Murray.
Can I just say thank you for putting this together? Like, it's something that sometimes goes underappreciated in some circles, and it was just really nice to be able to see it and appreciate the history, particularly for a newer college. See where you've come from, even in the relatively short time. So thank you.
Yes, there was a feeling that probably every club at the college has to at some point decide it wants to make an archive. And that has to start at some point, and it seemed we might as well do that sooner rather than later. Now that I've written a thesis, I can do other things.
But no, actually, keep up the good work. It was really good.
Well, perhaps then I hand back at this point to Bruce.
One last question from Harris. Maybe I can answer it for him. Do you want to hear embarrassing BCD stories, or does it need to be serious? I think the short answer is everything, right? But the tongue-in-cheek answer is it depends whether it concerns Hugh, probably.
I think there are interesting things from a lot of this. I think the stories are to be submitted as people feel fit. That is your account of your time in the club. How that is then pieced together to create a broader editorial picture of what the club looked like, I suppose, is a different challenge. So yes, a combination of everything is good. I mean, it tells you a story of what the club was like. It had rowdy boat club dinners, rather than just it was a boring club that gave up on boat club dinners because they were too expensive or something like that. I don't know. So yes, all information is useful, to be honest.
And I guess stories like how did the memorial prizes at M1 now have a tradition of, how did those traditions come into being, and anything else? Maybe there are traditions that were around that most of us weren't aware of because they died out as the people who remember
exactly
and left. So everything and anything, in short.
And we can at least keep a tally of how many different Cambridge curry houses are mentioned by name.
Well, then you have to figure out which ones are the same ones, just change name.
Exactly. There's a good question from Donovan on the chat, which maybe we won't answer now. I think that's probably one for Owen to follow up on, because that seems like an RCBC side of things rather than the PBC side of things. But there should clearly be some liaison with Hugh and anyone who does that.
So this is an interesting point, that if we are going for a 10-year project on this, there is 10 years of history still to come. And that is something that will be quite interesting, particularly with COVID. One might think that COVID would be one of these big events that maybe changed how the club runs, in the same way that perhaps other events in the past, like moving Boathouse, changed how the club was run. And it would be interesting to try and understand how that defines a new era, if it does or not. Things like that. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's going to be a road bump if nothing else, isn't it? And then there was cancellation one year from Foot and Mouth, I seem to remember. Yeah, all sorts of things that are not obvious, like tree photos and race results, that Hugh would love to hear.
I would say one other thing that I maybe didn't quite say. So from the material we have so far, the majority of it, there's not a great deal of it, but the majority of it is on the men's side of the club. And I think there is a lot of history that will be forgotten concerning either the women's side of the club or the lower boats, which I think is really important to try and piece together. And I think there's a danger of driving a lot of archive driven around very successful crews, and actually there's a lot of history in crews that were not necessarily as successful but still rode for 3 years or 4 years. So I think this is a call for people who maybe wouldn't have thought that we want to hear it. We want to hear everything. We want to hear about the rugby boats and the beer boats and the sunshine crews and all these other crews that may have been on the river at various points. It's not just the first boat storyline, because we can look at that on a bumps chart and in the bar.